Welcome once again. And after two interesting conversations, we now move to a very interesting conversation called as The Mountain and the Artist. This is in conversation with Manju, Jaya, and Alexander. It's the book, Roerich, A Quest and a Legacy, which has been edited by Manju. And Jaya and Alexander, both of them as Aurovillians, and who have, especially Alexander, has studied quite a bit of his works. It promises to be a very engrossing conversation, especially the title when we say The Mountain and the Artist. So it's quite evocative. I'm sure for the next 45 minutes, who has somebody left a rich legacy, but it's also a quest in each one of us. So, in conversation with Manju, Jaya, and Alexander. Welcome once again, Manju. Thank you so much.
So I'm very happy to extend our hearty welcome to the art historian, writer, artist, and filmmaker, Dr. Manju Kak, convener of the Peace Commission of the IAW in Geneva, and Secretary General of the All India Women's Conference. Back in 2009, Dr. Manju Kak organized an international conference on the life and work of Nicholas Roerich. The conference took place at the Jamia Millia Islamia University in Delhi and brought together a number of scholars from India, Russia, Great Britain, Italy, and Ukraine. And the results of this conference are published by Dr. Manju Kak in the volume titled Nicholas Roerich, A Quest and a Legacy. This book here, and you can see it outside also. So next year, we'll see the celebration of the 150th anniversary of Nicholas Roerich. We have been celebrating Sri Aurobindo's, now it is Nicholas Roerich coming. He was a great Russian artist, thinker, explorer of Central Asia, archaeologist, and a notable public figure who made India both his home and the place of his spiritual quest, his karma bhumi. It was almost exactly right now, a century ago, on November 30th, 1923, that Nicholas Roerich, his wife Helena Roerich, and their two sons, who were renowned scholars of Tibetan Buddhism, George Roerich, and the artist Sviatoslav Roerich, they disembarked in the port of Bombay. It was in India that they planned their stupendous Central Asian expedition that crossed, among other places, Sikkim, Kashmir, Ladakh, Mongolia, and Tibet. And it was in India that Roerich drafted his famous pact for the protection of historic monuments. It was in his estate in Nagar, in today's Himachal Pradesh, that he founded the first ever research institute for the comprehensive studies of the Himalayan region. He spent the last 20 years of his eventful life in the lap of the mighty Himalayas, capturing their very spirit in hundreds upon hundreds of unique canvases that are now found all over the world. Okay. So I would like to open with the first question to you, Manju. What brought you to Roerich, and how did you discover him? And I also was wondering, is it connected to your own long connection with the Himalayan region? Could you share with us a bit on this?
What brought me to Roerich, right? It's a personal story. I think for anybody and everyone, when they look at a piece of art, something has to be evoked within you. I was 21 years old, and I was at the Allahabad Museum, where they have perhaps one or two Roerichs. And I remember standing in front of a stunning landscape of the Himalayas and looking at it and asking the curator, who painted that? And at that point I knew that I would have to explore whoever it was much deeper. So, of course, I did the work when I was much older and a visiting professor at the Center for Nehru Studies in the Jamia University. But the image of Roerich's painting stayed with me just like Wordsworth's daffodils all through those decades. Do I have a response to the Himalayas? Yes and no. I grew up in Nainital where I went to school. But more than that, my genetic code is Kashmiri Pandit. And the Kashmiris, as you know, belong to a state surrounded by mountains. So my DNA definitely responds to Himalayas and the mountains. And more than the Himalayas and the mountains, the mythology, all the esoteric stories that talk about the elevation of the spirit connected with mountains is something that I grew up hearing about.
Because even though Roerich did not visit Ranikhet, but he spent some time in Kashmir, and several of his paintings are based on Kashmir, and there is a series of paintings called Pir Panjal, where he captures the beauty of the Pir Panjal range that he saw directly. We know that back in the 1970s, the government of India set up a commission to draft a list of artists, Indian artists, whose works were to be considered as national heritage of India, that is of the highest artistic value. After some deliberation, the commission came up with a list of 9 names that informally came to be known as Navratna, or 9 gems. So this list of 9 names included such illustrious members of the Tagore family as Rabindranath Tagore and Abanindranath Tagore, the representatives of the Bengali School of Art such as Jamini Roy and Nandalal Bose, and among these 9 names there was a name which was not Indian. It belonged to the person who was not born in India. In fact, he arrived in India when he was 50-years old. It was a Russian artist, Nicholas Roerich. And my first question would be, since it's a very unusual for any government to consider a foreign-born person, a foreign-born artist, to be a national heritage of this country. In fact, it's a high honor. Would you agree with this choice? And the second question, when the commission was deliberating on it, the criteria for choosing the names was that the art of this particular artist was to provide a particularly deep exploration of fundamental Indian values. So we would like to know, in your opinion, as both a scholar and an Indian, what are those fundamental Indian values that Nicholas Roerich explored and revealed in his art?
About the 9 Navratnas and your question as to why did they include Nicholas Roerich in those 9 Navratnas. I am not the right person to answer that question, but I can make a guess. When you read the history of the relationship of Pandit Nehru and Indira Gandhi with Roerich, way through 2930s, there was a coming and going at Nagar. Nehru at that time was a Fabian socialist. He'd been educated at Cambridge, he was at Eton, he was very, very influenced by the socialist movements of that time. He had the far-sightedness to make connections with leadership in the Comintern, in China and in Russia, because even then, as a struggling Congress worker, he knew that once India became independent, those personal relationships outside, because remember, the whole world was in turmoil. It was the Second World War. And not just India, there were other spheres of Asia as well as Europe that were struggling for their identity and nationhood. Nehru at that time, coming from the kind of egalitarian education he had a worldview in which he knew making connections with others was very important. And he made it a point for foreigners like Roerich settled in India to actually trek all the way up to Nagar. At that time, I don't think there was a motorable road. And they're very interested in black and white photographs of him, Svetoslav, Roerich, Helena Roerich, Indira Gandhi, Muhammad Yunus, all, together shot in the estate, Iswara. But Nehru was not that steeped in the whole mythology, ritual, and spiritual connection of India at that time, though his father had made it a point to have one of his tutors as a theosophist. Kashmiri community, which I come from, have always been very closely associated with the theosophical movement and Annie Besant. So one of the tutors, who was a friend of Annie Besant, was also Nehru's tutor, who tried to inculcate in him the whole ethos of what the theosophical movement was about. Remember, before we became politically independent or started movements of political independence, there was first the understanding and respect for Indian culture. And that's what theosophy gave to India. That awakening of the spirit is what Nicholas Roerich, and especially his wife Helena, imbued in Nehru at that time. Look into yourself, look into your culture, look at what your inheritance is. And he had long conversations with Nehru about it. And Helena was a disciple of Madame Blavatsky. Helena was close to the Adyar movement in Chennai, and she brought to Nehru the theosophical context, and I think the awakening of that in Nehru, he was grateful for that, opening the window of the soul of India. How does Roerich, a foreigner, symbolize in the Indian soul? Because if you look at his paintings, Banners of the East, they're all about the culture of peace, harmony, coexistence, and beauty. He always felt the pursuit of beauty meant the pursuit of peace. When you pursue something that is beauteous, you yourself are elevated, your spirit is elevated to a higher plane, in a plane in which you cannot find division or hatred for the other. The Himalayas symbolize that. The epic mythologies of the Himalayas symbolize that. The mountains have symbolized a region where the rishis and the munis and the spiritually elevated lived. So all that in his 19 paintings of the banners of the East, he called them. You have depictions of Muhammad, of Jesus, of Moses, of various luminaries from all the various spiritual heritage. And he tried to show the oneness of religions and the respect of all religions. And in pursuing and perceiving the absolutely momentous, stunning beauty of the whole Himalayan range, that is what he called Indianness. The basic Indianness was, as you have like a river where you absorb everything without friction. So that was the Indianness that he recognized and he created in Nehru. And of course the legacy of the Congress Party.
Thank you very much for such a wealth of historical information, and it's very interesting to know that a Russian artist, Nicholas Roerich, contributed to Nehru's discovery of India, of his own land. Thank you very much. As we know, Nicholas Roerich was a multifaceted personality who distinguished himself in struggle for peace, in the protection of historic monuments, in science and in art, as well as in literature. So, since you also distinguish yourself in different fields, we were wondering which aspect of Nicholas Roerich you would find closer to your heart, which aspect of his personality inspires you most. Roerich, the protector of cultural heritage, or Roerich, the explorer of the Himalayas, Roerich, the artist, or Roerich, the author of spiritual poetry?
As with Aurobindo, the rarest of the rare human beings that are born with layering and perceptions that are far more complex and complicated and diverse than the ones we see. As I was telling you, Alexander, that if I see 10 colors or 16 colors and weave them into my perception and my reaction of the world in any instant, the elevated human beings like Aurobindo and like Roerich perhaps perceive 200 or 20,000 at a moment, but those perceptions are so finely woven, the texture that emerges from those thoughts are so complex and complicated and yet so simplistic that when they give it back to you in the form of a painting or a philosophy, or they give it back to you in the form of a poem, everything merges and an orgasmic whole emerges. So it's just like we don't see a wave coming when the ocean is there. But when the wave comes and it just lifts up the water, you see that majestic moment. But the power behind it, starting from perhaps leagues and miles away, is not something you perceive. So similarly in Roerich, I would not identify any one of those strands that you're telling me, because each strand actually wove into the persona of Roerich and allowed him to output 7,000 plus paintings that he created in the world. And those 7,000 paintings that he created are a result of Roerich the traveler, Roerich the explorer, Roerich the thinker, Roerich the feminist, because he was completely devoted to his wife Helena, who herself was a very spiritual person and espoused the philosophy of Agni Yoga, which is, in other words, living ethics. And when he brings all those perceptions, that is when he creates a painting. If I may digress a bit, in the 20s and 30s and 40s and even 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, the Western world did not understand Roerich. His paintings were considered the depiction of something very linear and, something which did not intellectualize. The postmodern world, especially after the two world wars, was very influenced by Marxist perception, the workers, and how they perceived what art would be, and how art must teach, and art must proselytize. So art, just as an object of beauty, was something that they perhaps considered not so elevated. But when I stood in front of his paintings, I was in New York a long time ago before I became a Roerich scholar, and I used to visit the Roerich Museum in 107th Street on the west side. And every time I went there, I would be just, wrapped in front of those huge gigantic canvases where the color is illuminated. When you see those paintings in the mountains, you are transported to Ladakh, you're transported to Tibet, and you can actually see the sunshine or the moon incandescent on the peaks when you look at his painting. To capture that in totality and reality is a mark of genius. And I would wonder why nobody bought his paintings, and I think I was very stupid because neither did I. Yet, last year or maybe 2-3 years ago, suddenly the market just, Sotheby's, Christie's, everywhere, 300,000, 500,000, and true genius, it may remain hidden for some time, people may not comprehend, but if you have that spark in you that says, this is a man who lived, this is a man who understood the world, this is the man who had something to say, sooner or later that recognition comes. Just like with Aurobindo, 150 years of Aurobindo, next year 150 years or whatever of Roerich, such people, they are born to illuminate the world, they are born to illuminate our minds. And so we will not let them, different strands of them, disintegrate the wholeness of the experience of the human being. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, fully. Thank you very much. And just a small comment on your answer. When you deliberately refuse to analyze Roerich into different aspects, it reminded me of the answer of a certain art critic when he was asked whether he liked early Roerich more or mature Roerich more, meaning his Russian period and Indian period, so which are clearly different in many respects.
Absolutely.
He quite unexpectedly for the audience said it is not legitimate to truncate Roerich into early and mature. It's a very interesting take on that.
Can I talk a little bit about his early period?
Please do.
Roerich's early period when he was living in Isvara, also, you know, the house that he inhabited near St. Petersburg, and which I've had the privilege to see, where he trained under, I think, Kudinsky, if I'm not, Guinchi, that was his name of the artist, who was his teacher. And if you happen to go to Moscow and you go to the museum, I think, Tretyakov Gallery?
Yeah, Tretyakov Gallery.
Yeah. And you look at the Russian landscape painters, you are moved to the point where you say, how did I ever go to the Louvre? What is the Louvre in front of something that has that kind of, art which is hidden from the world? Because the Russians, keep their artists very close to their heart and they don't let them out. Roerich trained under those artists, and so his early paintings show the influence of, architecture, archaeology. He was an archaeologist also, but in each of them they showed that he was looking to preserve. Everywhere there's the connotation of preserving what the earth has to offer, preserving the cultural heritage of mankind, preserving the monuments or what the churches or anything else. It's only when the Bolsheviks take over, and that's the end of the Romanovs and Russia as we know it, as they knew it, that he decided that this bloodshed has to end. He had a kind of premonition that the world in Europe was at the brink of something disastrous, that something was going to happen that was going to absolutely shatter the world. This is 1916, 1917, 1918, and then Lenin and Trotsky and later on the others, absolutely annihilated whatever was Romanov and other dynastic Russian culture. So in quest of, again, beauty and culture, Roerich felt that, and as I was telling Alexander, the Royal Russian eagle faces both ways. It faces east and west. He felt the answers lay not in the west, but lay in the east, in what was Buddhist Russia, in what was Asian Russia, in Siberia, in Mongolia, in the lands that lay where the Buddha had walked. And so he then went on this journey, discovering that Russia which was hidden underneath. And as we discussed, beneath all that was also his own Nordic and Viking roots. And on his mother's side, he was Slav. So they always come from old cultures. And in the old Russian culture, there was that these pure people live in the Russian land of the white waters. I don't know the Russian term for that, but old Russia is somewhere near the Altai, is that called the Altai? The Altai range. And so in those realms where you have, mountains and you have, the vast steppes and you have no human footfalls, that's where the pure land exists, and these super souls, or these souls that are absolutely pure, they exist there. So he went in search of Shambhala, or the search for this land of where the pure people live, and that lay all in the east. So that is his quest, was in the east, and that's what brought him to his two great journeys, one from 1924 to 28, which he took via Leh, Ladakh, and Kashmir, and the other which he went to outer Mongolia, looking for those places where purity and beauty could exist without conflict, without bloodshed. So I've digressed a bit, but I thought I would just explain something of his art. It's nothing but natural that when he finished all that and he landed in Nagar, in Kulu, in Himachal, what was he going to paint? He was not going to paint monuments, he was not going to paint anything that man built. He was going to paint what God built, or what God made. And what God made were these mountains, the Himalayas, the Trans-Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, as well as, everything else. So that is why his latter paintings are so different, whereas his taught paintings are different. The latter paintings come from his response from the heart and from Helena Roerich's teachings, which are Agni Yoga. In fact, if you see one of the paintings which is there, it's called She Who Leads. They always say Roerich's paintings were painted by two people, himself and his wife Helena, because she is the one, through conversation and through her own understanding of ethics, led him into those zones of purity of the mind so that he could see. And until you see, you see our minds are like, dusty window panes. We have conflicting thoughts. And it's only when all those thoughts, like in a glass of water, you put a little bit of mud, and your mind is like that. It's sort of all dusty and cloudy. And later when it settles down, then you see the clarity of water. So our minds are like that. It is Helena who created the clarity in his mind for him to perceive the mountains, to paint them as they were. Another thing I must say, unless you have that in your mind, you cannot see a Roerich painting. It's just like when we say we go to a temple and you pray to the idol, Krishna or Ganesh or Shankar or Vishnu. You don't see the God in that patthar ki murti. You just see an idol. But it's when your mind and heart is clear and actually seeks, if you have the seeking spirit, then that stone statue doesn't become a stone statue. It becomes the symbol and emblematic of the spiritual. And that is what the mother experienced, and that is what Sri Aurobindo experienced. And that is why Auroville exists, and that is why we call the soil sacred, or we call it, endowed with the holy.
So we have actually been hearing you speak quite a bit about Helena Roerich, and I wanted to ask about her, because it is, I came across Nicholas Roerich already in 1973, but Helena Roerich only maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So, and when you see him at the front in the photos, etc., and it was just marked out by Alexander when we were talking earlier, that if she's in the photo at all, she will be looking to the side or looking down, while he is always straight to the camera, no? Really, it seems she was at the center of the family and at the center of the work. And also, it seems to me that there is, in his paintings, with the mountains, with other things, there is also this focus on the feminine goddess, whether it is the Madonna or the Eastern. Could you bring a bit more about this, because it is always, and I think today especially, very, when we are moving towards a real equality between men and women, and a new world which actually goes beyond, maybe transcends the masculine and the feminine. Could you talk a little bit more about this?
Yes, I would like to tell you that what Helena believed in, if I can read a little bit about her. In her teachings of the Agni Yoga, in her very many texts, she says the teachings of living ethics, which were given to her by Master Maurya, that is a hierarch. What did she mean by a hierarch? She meant spirits that are there, that come into the world to guide chosen people into the path of light before the world destructs itself. So, when you take those teachings, and not just like, okay, let's have a brownie or let's have a rasgulla, but as something that imbues your whole life, then only will the world change. That's what she believed. There was a strong link between human behavior and the development of the world. Mankind was given the world like a ship, and he was the steward, and it was his honored role to actually push that ship across the waters safely to the other side. So human behavior and development are linked. It is when human behavior changes that development will go the way it saves the world rather than destroys the world. But human behavior, when it is governed by patriarchy or the masculine, which by its very connotation is about power, then the development of the universe will always be in dangerous ground. And remember, it was between the two world wars, and she was able to see what's coming. So she said, when you bring the feminine principle back into politics, into political thought, because the mother, the nurturer of the world, whether she's Durga or whether she's, in all mother goddesses in every culture, whether it's Greek culture, Egyptian culture, they've always been venerated as nurturers, as the persona of keeping the world safe, gathering food, giving enough plenty, not as symbols of power. And so when she said, when you revert the whole structure of patriarchy and make the feminine principle the guiding aspect of politics and development, then human behavior will also change. Today, philosophies around the world have accepted and acknowledged that. And patriarchy, as you know, has, you have gender sensitization, you have all kinds of things that are happening in the dialogue of development world. But before all these were happening, they were happening in the spiritual mind of Helena Roerich. And she tried to use Roerich's paintings to forcefully show that, as you may have just seen 2 or 3 pictures of, the mother of the world, the protector, and she who leads, and a lot of Roerich's paintings are, like that. So when we talk about Agni Yoga, Helena Roerich, we always say that she was the intellect, she was the conceiver, she was the one who realized the painting in her mind and what it was to show and depict, and then he was her hand who actually, executed it. And that is what. I don't know if I've answered your question.
I say thank you. Yes.
Precise answer. And in fact, the director of the Roerich Museum in Moscow, known to you, Ludmila Shaposhnikova, once mentioned, and it was his theory and her interpretation of Roerich's art, that each painting by Roerich should be considered as an illustration to Agni Yoga. It's not just a landscape. It's not just for the beauty of it. It's an illustration to a certain idea. And it was through Helena Roerich that the Agni Yoga was brought and developed. So it was a very beautiful and synergistic relationship between two people who walked through life and supported each other and co-created extremely beautiful and important things. Since you mentioned your experience back in Allahabad and Roerich's collection there, it may be mentioned here that quite a number of museums, government museums in India, hold in their collections the paintings by Nicholas Roerich and his remarkable son, Svetoslav, his younger son, who in fact chose to stay in India, never returned to Russia, got married to an Indian citizen, and himself became an Indian citizen, although inside continued to be a deeply Russian person. So he was a remarkable artist in his own right. So we are talking about government museums, cultural and educational institutions all over the country, name it, north, south, west, east. And there are around 300 identifiable paintings whose locations have been identified. Plus there may be some private collections. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody has attempted to come up with a book, with an art album bringing these works together. And as we know now, it's the national heritage of this country. So nobody brought them together, nobody published Roerich's art from Indian collections. And I believe that it will be a very important contribution towards bringing Nicholas Roerich's name back on India's cultural horizon. And I was wondering, since you have edited the results of the conference that you organized, and it's a beautiful edition with very, very high quality printing. In fact, Roerich's paintings are very difficult to reproduce. They're proverbially difficult to reproduce because of their strikingly brilliant colors. But it's a very good job that the Niyogi Books has done. So I was wondering if you could consider bringing out a book, which will require, of course, a lot of liaison with different government institutions, but it is not impossible after all. In case it is interesting to you, we'll be very happy to share the information about the locations of those paintings. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, regardless of who does it, it is something that should be done. Well, I don't know about that, but I feel that why it should be done is not so much because of the paintings, but because of the prophecy as well as the vision that, especially today when we have climate change and all these things that they talk about now, we have evidence to say that through artistic endeavor or through literature or through Sri Aurobindo, these things were thought of and spoken of as things that can happen to the world, and we hadn't taken notice of it. Can I read something by Deepak Chopra?
You're most welcome.
It is commonly felt civilizations dominated by patriarchal constructs that celebrate dominant masculine aggression as a model for power, and I'm not saying America, have led to the arms race, world wars, civil conflicts, and an insane build-up of atomic bombs reaching some kind of apex that is also a dead end. Instead, the qualities of intuition and creativity, of restoration and birth, of nurturing and collaboration, attributed to the feminine principle, can change the future of this planet away from war, economic and cultural domination, to an awareness of the holistic, interconnected nature of creation, and can generate powerful positive energy. So that today, whether it's the United Nations or anyone else, we're talking about caring economies and not competitive economies, where economies give as much weightage to the care aspect of our society as much as it gives to the profit-driven aspect of our society. These are things Helena Roerich talked about. These are things philosophers of that time talked about. And today it's a reality. So paintings like Nicholas Roerich, when you say they were depictions of her thoughts and her ideas, were prophetic in a way to tell us this is where the world was coming to. I see Sudha, which means we are ending our session.
This conversation could go on and on. And I'm hoping that at some point in time, you would consider coming back to Auroville and deepen and engage in these conversations. Talking about art, you see these beautiful paintings over here, Manju. It's a humble effort by the artists from Auroville and Pondicherry, where the sale proceeds of this goes back to securing lands for Auroville. And what you talked about, what we're giving back, this is one little effort, one little drop into that direction. And there is something that art speaks. I think sometimes art speaks even much more than the word. So thank you for the amazing book. I've had a glimpse of it. And it's a beautiful gift. It's a
Anybody
beautiful, beautiful gift.
Has a question, I don't know.
So
Your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that was really lovely. You brought him, if I can use the word, alive in a very different way for us. You brought him closer to us, and in a way inspiring us to know more about him, which is, I think, is in a way a legacy for us to continue with. So thank you so much. Can I just give requests Sanjeev ji and Chandramouli ji to give?
Does anybody have a question?
Oh, okay. Does anybody have a question? Please. Okay, you'll have to take this one.
Thank you. I find this conversation very, very inspiring. And what do you see the future of art in general that can be part of the inner, revealing inner spiritual journey to illuminate mankind? So would you elaborate on that?
I don't think it needs an elaboration. The future of art will always be the quest of the human spirit. And wherever the human spirit goes, that's where art will go.
Very brief, what exactly is Agni Yoga?
Agni Yoga is the yoga of fire, and it is when the self goes through struggle, a courage is born. And courage is very important to development. Helena Roerich says there are two types of courage. The courage of the flaming heart. The courage of the flaming heart is when you fight against injustice, or you have to get up and do something. So without courage, man is nothing. But courage is only born when you go through tests repeatedly, and that struggle creates that courage. But when you don't have the courage of the flaming heart, you have the courage of fear, which means dar ke mare. For example, aapke ghar mein koi, some bandits get into your house. Out of sheer fear, you take up a gun and you start shooting. So, but without courage, you cannot live, and society will not develop. Human behavior will never reach its best. But how do you get courage? You get courage by the practice of Agni Yoga, or the yoga of fire. Fire meaning struggle, fire meaning friction, fire meaning challenging day to day. And like the Roerichs challenged themselves to go into Mongolia and to go into China, from 60-80 horses they were left with 2. They fought life, they fought existence to create something. So the role of struggle in your life is what Agni Yoga talks about.
We could go on, but I see Sudha's stare.
Yes. She's probably staring at me as well, huh?
No, not staring. Oh, there are 3 people having questions.
Maybe one question. No, that is Svetoslav. That's his son, who is a very different kind of painter, the one who married Devika Rani, the very different kind of painter. Not Nicholas, maybe a few only.
Just give him first and then you take it.
Madam, you mentioned that your DNA belongs to the mountain terrain, your genetic code. Is that of the mountains?
No, not mine. I'm a Kashmiri Brahmin.
Kashmiri Brahmin. I am coming to that point. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru also came to the script discovery of India because of he lived in a mountainous terrain.
Sorry?
So, mountainous terrain. He was a product of the mountains.
No, he was not brought up with the Mohammedans. He was brought up in Allahabad.
Okay. But while he was in the jail, he was face to face with the mountains.
Not at all. Jawaharlal Nehru was brought up in Allahabad, and then he went to Eton and he went to Harrow and Cambridge, which is in England. When you say Mohammedan, both the whole culture of Eastern UP and Awadh was always called the Ganga Jamani culture, which is, these were the rulers were always the Nawabs of Awadh and the Mohammedan kings, etc. And so there was the culture of especially the Shia culture, which was part of the UP, the whole UP ethos.
I would like to ask a mountain as a trigger for creativity. That is my question.
Sorry, Mohammedan as a trigger?
A mountain as a trigger
Oh,
of
the mountain. Oh, I heard Mohammedan. I'm so sorry.
mountain is a trigger of creativity.
What is the mountain as a?
Trigger for creativity.
Any pure spaces, any spaces that enlighten the mind. It can be the sea, it can be the horizon.
Okay.
So those spaces where there is beauty,
Okay.
it can be a beautiful woman, it can be a beautiful man. It is beauty that informs creativity, and struggle, and sometimes tragedy, and sometimes if you look at Marxist art and you look at the art of the communist China and Russia, it is also human tragedy. It is the extremes of human feelings that inform art, not necessarily only the mountain.
Exactly.
But yes, the mountain is one of them.
Exactly.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful session. My question is, it would be incomplete to finish this lecture without talking about the legacy of Roerich and his Roerich Charter, which he gave to the United Nations. Can you maybe...
Oh, the Roerich Pact.
The pact, I'm sorry.
There was no United Nations. The League of Nations was going to be born. 1934 or so, he gave the charter to, I think, was it Roosevelt? I'm forgetting, to the American president at that time. And that was the formation of the League of Nations. That is why he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. But eventually it became part of the Hague Convention in 1954, which was the charter which today says the preservation of monuments and architectural heritage in times of war. That was Roerich's contribution on the political front, that all man-made objects of, whether it's bridges or whether it's this thing, should be no war zone. And that is what the Roerich Pact was about, a very intricate legal pact. It is something that he said. You can Google and read about it.
She's available for conversations, so there is a space we want to meet and talk to her, but we do need to move on to the next and the last concluding session, which is about poetries. But before we move on, Manju, once again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.